All right. Thank you guys for coming tonight. We want this to be super informal, so if you guys ever have any questions or anything, feel free to ask them, but we'll ask at the end as well. But yeah, thank you so much for coming tonight on your long weekend. It actually means so much to Jaden and I. We're just starting this part of our work, which is to raise awareness and building educational presentation. So this is kind of you guys are kind of our guinea pigs. So if you have insight afterwards or suggestions or thoughts, we would really appreciate them. So yeah, so Jaden and I are working for Woven International, which is an organization that works to combat human trafficking in Southeast Asia. And we are also working locally to address human trafficking and exploitation in our Indigenous communities here in Canada. So if you don't know, Jaden and I are Austrian on my mom's side, and I shared this with everyone who was in church today, but like super Austrian. Like we make schnitzel for Christmas rather than turkey. And we, on our dad's side, we're an equal mix of Ukrainian and Indigenous. So my dad, my sister, and I are Soto. And so we come from the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe people of Fishing Lake First Nation Reserve on Treaty 4.
So Jacqueline has been working with Woven for like 2 years. I started volunteering back in July, and then this summer I've been taking on a new part-time role with Woven. And yeah, we'll just go into the presentation.
Yeah, so to give you guys a little bit of insight into what tonight looks like, you can go to the next slide. We're kind of aiming for about an hour, and we'll break in the middle for some snacks and some coffee or tea or water. We'll also be referencing a lot of different resources throughout the presentation. So at the front there, if you saw on the table, there are some QR codes, some for our newsletter and some to get our resource list that we've put together for people watching online. We have a QR code at the very end of our presentation that will go to our resource list, which you can check out as we're referencing more. Also, before we go forward, I just wanted to mention and address the fact that a lot of what we talk about tonight is quite heavy. There's a lot of pain and trauma in the things that we're talking about, and for those watching online, just so that you know as well. If you at any point ever need to just take a step out, take a break, you're so more than welcome to. Feel free to pause the video if you're watching online. And also, Jaden and I will be hanging around afterwards if you ever wanted to talk about anything more in depth as well. So if you want to go to the next slide, I just wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And we just want to honor the original peoples of this land and who still live on this land.
If you can go to the next slide. So a term we found was terra nullius. This means territory with no master. And I think we've all done land acknowledgements before, but something that we did our research into is why are they so important? What's the significance behind them? So this term, terra nullius, made possible the Indian Act and all of its genocidal laws and policies, including the residential school system, the removal of Indigenous peoples from their traditional lands to reserves, criminalization of languages, cultural ceremonies, and the recognition and later denial of treaty and Indigenous rights. So the failure to recognize the current and historic presence of Indigenous peoples contributes to the power of terra nullius. So the purpose of land acknowledgements attempts to change this negative narrative that Indigenous peoples were not the first people of the land. In this way, it also dehumanizes them by saying their presence didn't count. So it's important to recognize this to continually honor their past and current presence, not out of just favor or courtesy, but out of a way to restore the needed justice.
Yeah, so you can go to the next slide. So as we head into this month, which is in our country the month of truth and reconciliation, we were wanting to essentially equip you guys with the knowledge and resources to go about this month in a good way. We believe that the first step to going about this well is through learning. And we are in no means experts on any of the topics that we discuss. We've been doing research for about a year, learning from experts. And so once again, all of the resources that we are going to talk about and reference we'll have at the very end for you guys to look into. So if you want to go to the next slide, Dad, it's our dad in the slides. Everyone can maybe give him a little wave. Thanks, Dad. So before we kind of dive into this, we kind of wanted to give a bit of a crash course on what human trafficking even looks like. Have you guys seen the movie with Liam Neeson called Taken? Yeah? Okay, well, it's nothing like that. So take everything that you saw and remember from that movie and just put it out of your mind. So human trafficking is a lot more complex. It doesn't look like people chained up. It is a lot more, there's trauma, there's complexity, there's a lot of poverty and desperation in there. So the truth is also, we also think about human trafficking as being very overseas, but it happens in every single country all over the world, including here in Canada. It's a huge, huge problem here, actually. And Jaden is going to walk us through a quick crash course in what human trafficking is and looks like. Once again, there's some more resources specifically about human trafficking in Canada in the resource guide at the end.
Yeah, so defined in the Criminal Code of Canada, it's defined as recruiting, housing, controlling the movements of a person, using means such as force, physical or psychological coercion, or deception to cause someone to provide their labor or sexual services. And so below that, there's a bunch of definitions. So these terms and definitions are directly pulled from a discussion guide called Speak Out, Stop Sex Trafficking. So it was created by Indigenous partners whose goal is to stop sex trafficking and support survivors. I also just wanted to note that some of the terms seem kind of like fun, light words, and this was done with intention to make it seem like it's a fun, easy way to make money when the reality is much harsher. So the first one, game. So this is used to describe the subculture of prostitution and sex trafficking. It has rules, levels of authority, a unique language seen like in the word itself. And there's even like handbooks for how to pimp. So there's a lot more to it than just itself. So a trick is a sex act performed for money or the person buying it. Someone who is being sex trafficked is turning a trick or with a trick. A John is an individual who pays for or exchanges something of value for services. Johns create the demand. A pimp is a person who controls and financially benefits from the commercial sexual exploitation of another person. Pimp and sex trafficker are interchangeable terms. And then we'll just do one more. A bottom is a female appointed by the trafficker, pimp, to supervise the others, report rule violations, kind of just like their right hand, and they can instruct victims, collect money, book hotel rooms, etc.
You can go to the next slide. So like I said, human trafficking does not look like it does in the movies. Very, very rarely are people genuinely kidnapped. 91% of reported victims actually knew their trafficker. And we know that men, women, and members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community are all victims of exploitation, but it's primarily girls and women. 96% of victims are women. Also, I think sometimes when we think of trafficking, we also think of women being brought over from other countries, but it's actually only 10% of cases are of internet or people being brought in. 90% of trafficking actually is domestic, which is really important. If you want to go to the next slide, Jaden's going to just outline a little bit about what it actually looks like, what the process looks like.
Yeah, and so like Jacqueline said, it can also look different in every situation. A common trend is the victim knows their exploiter. It could be a family member, a relative, someone they're in a relationship with. So Jacqueline and I got the privilege of attending a 8-week workshop. It focused on healthy relationships, and 1 week the topic was on exploitation. We had someone come in and explain their story of being a sex trafficking victim in Calgary. So this individual, and there's the terms on the right, and I'm just gonna use this story to illustrate each term, so it kind of makes more sense. So the individual is 15 when she moved to Calgary. She had a rough home life in BC, living with her mom and stepdad. She finally was able to convince her mom to let her move to Calgary with her aunt. So at this point, she's in a new city, kind of desperate to make friends, and she was at the train station one day, approached by a guy who was about 18, so not too much older, just a little bit. And he started asking her questions, complimenting her, just taking an overall interest in her. This is an example of luring. So this is when the sex trafficker takes a sudden interest in the person, asking questions, saying nice things, taking you out, spending money on you. So it's all done with intention to find out information about you and to potentially use that information against you later on. This goes into grooming, and it's similar as luring, but in this one they're trying to get you to take on a new lifestyle, pushing you to pushing your boundaries to be sexier. And so in this way, she was stressed in school, and he said, oh, I have something that you can take to calm you down so you're not so stressed and so you can focus more. He said it's kind of a lighter drug, like if you want, it will help you, and so she ended up taking it. And so this was pushing her lifestyle, and it was a few months later that the drug started, instead of making her feel better, it made her feel worse. And it was at this point that she found out she was doing meth for the past 4 months. One day she was doing drugs with her boyfriend in her room, and her auntie walked in, and her auntie gave her an ultimatum of saying, you can either stay with him, but you guys both have to leave, or you can stay with me, he leaves, and we'll take you to treatment. At this point, she's in isolation with him. This is when the trafficker cuts you off from your family, friends, support systems, to make them seem like they're the only option in your life. This enables them to have control over you. So at this point, her boyfriend was her only support system, so she decided to go with him. That can go into manipulation. So this is when the sex trafficker asks you to perform sex acts for money, to pay for the lifestyle that they've given you as a repayment, or to keep up this lifestyle and for a future together. And that's exactly what he did. He asked her to go spend a weekend at their friend's house and said, you'll just be staying here and I'll pick you up on Monday. And she said, like, okay. And that was the first weekend that she was sexually exploited. It kept getting more and more. He would drop her off in a back alley and meet a John. And he would say, please do this. I love you so much. You need to do this for us to keep our lifestyle up. I love you so much. And then when she'd come back, he would say, thank you for doing this. This is how we can keep up our lifestyle. And so it was in this way she was so manipulated that she thought she was choosing to do these things herself. That went into threats. And so this is when the sex trafficker can coerce you by exposing the things you've done, hurting your family. And so that's what he started doing. She then got transported to a house, also known as a brothel, that contained lots of girls who were the workers. And so this was in Calgary in the Northeast. There was like a group of girls there, and they would all fight constantly about who would go out to work that night for them. They were housed there, got food and drugs there, and so the traffickers used this as a way to exploit them by having this control over them. And then all around it just leads to the exploitation. So that's the main goal of the sex trafficker, is to control and exploit you by forcing you to have sex in exchange for things you need or want. So they can abuse a relationship, trust, authority, or dependency with you in order to exploit you. And if you say no, they can lead to the threats. But yeah, something to note is many cases the survivors didn't recognize that their boyfriends were the ones that were exploiting them. Since these activities were so normalized by, even if they're children, or they become so normalized by being in that subculture, it doesn't seem like you're being exploited even though you are.
Yeah, and also something to add, the manipulation actually goes quite deep. So what happens actually in a lot of situations with drugs is the pimp or the boyfriend will they'll get the girl hooked on drugs, but he'll never teach her how to use it. So not only is she manipulated, she's in love with this guy, and he's manipulating her that way, but a lot of times they actually they trap them essentially in these situations, because like he's the only one that will ever be able to get her drugs, or he's the only one who actually can help her get a fix, right? So there's so many levels to this, and that's why we say it's not as simple as someone just being kidnapped. There's so many different levels of trauma and manipulation, and once again, like what Jaden said, a lot of victims actually don't even realize they've been trafficked until years later in therapy. If you want to go to the next slide.
So this is just some statistics. So while Indigenous women make up only 4% of the population, they make up 50% of the recorded trafficking victims. And we've also read in other articles that the statistic has been much higher, up to 90% in certain regions. And I just want to note that this is recorded only, so the reality is likely much, much higher.
Yeah, the stat literally blew our minds when we heard about it, that you could make up such a small amount, but make up over half of all the victims of trafficking. If you can go to the next slide. So this is where does this even happen? Like, is it only in Ontario? So essentially, a lot of the girls are shipped along main highway routes. So between Thunder Bay to Toronto, Winnipeg to North Dakota, Vancouver to Washington, a lot of the girls are brought up and down those highways. Big cities like Calgary and Edmonton are huge hotspots as well. The other thing, the other main hotspots are actually natural resource rich communities or work camps. So you have a lot of young men who are away from their families who have a lot of money, and a lot of these work camps actually are close to reserves. And so a lot of Indigenous women are placed at higher risk just because of where they live. So it's kind of important for us as a community in Estevan even, like we're right by the border. There's a lot of resources up here. Trafficking happens here as well. And once again, we can't go too much into what trafficking looks like and how it works, how exactly to recognize it, but that's why we've put a lot of resources into the end of this presentation. But if you could go to the next slide. So we shared the stat that Indigenous women make up 50% of reported cases, but how serious is this problem in our country? Indigenous women experience sexual assault 3 times more than non-Indigenous women. This one's crazy. Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to be murdered than any other woman in Canada, and 16 times more likely than Caucasian women. So there's this whole movement across North America called Missing or Murdered Indigenous Women, and it's essentially a movement that is advocating and raising awareness for the high rates of disappearances and murders and violence against Indigenous women. So I'm sure if you look on Instagram, there's a lot of handles, mostly MMIW, but it's recently expanded to include women, girls, two-spirit individuals, as well as men who are exploited as well. And a lot of people that I've talked to are quite surprised. They had no idea that this is going on. And a lot of scholars in our research have argued that it's because so much of our attention is on international trafficking that essentially the trafficking that happens locally, it becomes invisible. Because of this invisibility and lack of attention, Indigenous women are extremely vulnerable to being targeted for human trafficking, and the average age of entry into exploitation for Indigenous women and girls is actually 13, which is wild. So why are Indigenous women overrepresented in the sex trade and human trafficking? If you can go to the next slide. So it's rooted, and that the whole point of this presentation is this: it's rooted in colonization, the residential system, and intergenerational trauma. There's a lot of discussion on choice in the media, and I just want to be clear that I'm not speaking for all workers in the sex trade. I'm speaking specifically to the disproportionate amount of Indigenous women in the sex trade. But this conversation of choice is actually a myth when it comes to Indigenous women. And this is supported by multiple Indigenous female activists in Canada. Just for example, Jackie Lynn, she's a Métis woman, she's a social worker, a formal prostitute. She's been researching prostitution academically for almost 20 years. She says that choice assumes everyone is on a level playing field, but it diverts attention from the actual problem. Cherry Smiley, who the quote is by on the screen here, she is an activist, she's amazing, she's written a lot of research papers on exploitation. She says that this whole concept of choice is actually offensive to Indigenous women, because it would mean that Indigenous women actually like to have sex more than non-Indigenous women with strangers, and that's simply not true. That actually feeds into this racist myth that Indigenous peoples are savage, that that women are inherently sexualized, that they're unintelligent, and that's simply not true. There's a lot of other there's a lot of other activists like Jeanette Lavelle. She's the former president of the Native Women's Association. She's an Anishinaabe, which is what Jaden and I are. And she said in an article that that is referenced in the bottom of this slide if anyone is interested. But she says that in Anishinaabe, there's actually no word for prostitution, that it's not even part of our culture. And so to assume that this is inherently a choice is actually a myth, and it's not true. There's other really inspiring individuals like Bridget Perrier, who I would highly recommend looking up as well. But the contributing factors to the disproportionate number of Indigenous women in the sex trade who are being exploited include the collective trauma that resulted from the residential school system, racism, poverty, inadequate housing, limited educational opportunities, high rates of violence, and a lack of culturally safe support services.
You can go next, please. So what was Indigenous culture like before colonization? And I just want to note that this is just a generalized trend that we found in our research, and it's not going to be the same amongst all Indigenous people. But men and women, although they had different roles, responsibilities, and duties, were seen as equal. Lots of times the child that was born took the maternal clan rather than the paternal. So women were believed to be sacred because they were the life-bearing individuals. Communities were self-sufficient, self-reliant, and self-disciplined. They had their own politics, they had their own governance, they held votes, and they were just completely self-sustainable. Their relationship with the land was based on stewardship, honor, and spiritual connection. Everything that is taken from our land was seen as a gift, and before things were taken, there were offerings prior. And so this just goes to the narrative that Indigenous peoples don't see ownership to the land, but as a mutual connection and respect, rather than, I think a lot of time, Western mentality is the land we are on is the land we own, and we treat it that way. And in several people groups, it was the women who appointed the chiefs, who had the final say over whether a nation could declare war. So there was a lot of power that the women held and respect.
So to understand the history is actually quite important to understand why this is such a injustice against Indigenous peoples. Like the women were respected, honored, they had a place of leadership, they were equal to their male counterparts. And we see the change in history after colonization. If you want to go to the next slide. Oh, yes. Also, there's this really amazing free university course that the University of Alberta offers. It's free, and it essentially goes through history, it goes through reconciliation, it goes through Indigenous communities, Indigenous thought. It's also, once again, referenced in our resource guide. Highly, highly recommend. It's completely free. If you wanted to pay a fee, you could get credited for it as well, but just wanted to plug that. So we can't understand the current reality, the disproportionate amount of women who are exploited, without understanding the history of colonization. They're deeply connected. You can't separate the two. So we're going to go through a quick crash course in history, and then we'll take a quick break because the next few things we're going to talk about is quite heavy. So the first instance of sexual exploitation was country wives, if you want to go to the next slide. So during the beginning of settlement of Canada, when you had the fur traders, if we remember learning about this in school, so a lot of European women weren't actually allowed to immigrate for the first 100 years of our history. So a lot of the fur traders would actually take the Indigenous women as wives, and they were called country wives. And so they were used for both sex and for their knowledge of the land, which was quite useful for the men as they were trading fur. So they would have families with these women. But what happened is these country wives and their children were not deemed as legitimate property. I say with air quotes. They were not deemed as legitimate property of the men by English common law, which meant that when the European women came over, when their European wives came over, these men were able to just drop these women and their families without consequence. So what happened during this very long period of history that I'm smushing into like a 1-minute discussion is women were devalued from a place of honor, from a place of respect, from a place of leadership to becoming disposable with no consequence. Their value in society became almost non-existent. If you want to go to the next slide.
So the book here quoted is 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. It has a lot of really interesting information, and I would recommend for you guys to read. But so the Indian Act has been in place for 140 years, containing policies that have trapped communities in poverty, dependence, and the state of kind of plateau. When it originated, John A. MacDonald stated its purpose to be the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So the act imposed great personal and cultural tragedy on First Nations, many of which continue to affect communities, families, and individuals today. So some of the policies were that they denied women status, they introduced residential schools, created reserves, renamed individuals with European names. This is something that Jacqueline and I know personally, as our grandma's siblings. We were going through some of her books and saw their names written down, and I was like, that's not their name. And our grandma told us that when they were in day school, they decided that too many people had that name or they weren't European enough. And so right there, they're like, oh, that's not your name, this is now your name. And so that's what we've known ever since. They restricted First Nations from leaving the reserve. They enforced enfranchisement on any First Nation admitted to university, meaning that they lost their status, their Indigenous status, and this was not removed until 1985. They could expropriate portions of reserves for roads, railways, and other public works, as well as move entire reserves away from a municipality if they thought it was fit. And yeah, and another really impactful quote we read from a research paper called The Need for Indigenous-Led Responses was, under the Canadian state, when Indigenous women's status under the Indian Act was revoked because they married non-Indigenous men or Indigenous men without status, they were typically denied access to personal property willed to them and evicted from their homes. Oftentimes with small children and no money, these exclusions were exemplified when these marriages broke down, thereby sending generations of Indigenous women and their children toward economic marginalization and poverty, both of which are, of course, present-day risk factors for being targeted for human trafficking. So essentially, the Indian Act forced a lot of women into poverty.
And this is a book that so when people ask why are Indigenous communities in the state that they are in, why does our country look the way that it does, this is the book that I recommend every single time. If you don't know about the history, if you don't know why things are the way they are, you don't understand, read this book, 21 Things You Didn't Know. It's so incredibly well written and well put. The next piece of history that I want us to explore is residential schools. If you want to go to the next slide. So we've heard a lot about residential schools over the last year, right? With the 215 children being found in unmarked graves in Kamloops. So I feel we've been talking a lot about that. So I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially between the 1800s, the late 1800s and 1996, which was very recent, only 26 years ago, the Government of Canada and church organizations operated the Indian residential school system. So an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes, their families, their communities, often by law enforcement, and often by threat of incarceration of their parents or removal from their community. So the goal of the residential school system was complete assimilation of Indigenous children. The goal was to completely get rid of Indigenous culture and assimilate Indigenous peoples into the greater society. But the problem was these schools, instead of annihilating the culture, they actually didn't, because our Indigenous peoples still exist. But what they did do is they caused deep trauma. So a lot of these schools were overcrowded, underfunded, tuberculosis was rampant, a lot of the children were malnourished, so a lot of children passed away. Their mortality rates in some schools across Canada actually had a mortality rate of 60%, which is wild. So, and as of September 2021, so this time last year, the Center for Truth and Reconciliation has documented the deaths of over 4,000 children in these homes, and that's just the recorded number is actually a lot higher. So the system for residential schools also was notorious for physical, sexual, spiritual, and mental abuse by the caregivers there. So if you want to go to the next slide, so there was also something similar called Indian day schools, and this is actually what our grandma, our family, are survivors of. And they're very similar to residential schools. The children actually stay in their homes, but there's similar abuse and similar trauma that exists. The goal was still to assimilate and annihilate Indigenous culture. There's something that I want to speak to, because something that I've heard quite a few times actually over the last year of our research was, my grandfather or I went to boarding school back in the day and I got hit, I got abused, it wasn't a nice place for me either. Why are Indigenous peoples, why do we keep talking about residential schools? And I want to say that when we talk about these things, one person's trauma does not negate another person's trauma. Just because we're talking about the trauma of Indigenous peoples doesn't mean we're now discounting the trauma of other people. We're not denying that many people have had a very hard life. What we're doing when we have these conversations, however, is acknowledging the extent, the corporate, cultural nature of residential schools. An entire culture of people were taught that they were backwards, they were savage, their culture was inherently demonic, and they were second-class citizens. They didn't even have the right to vote. They were second-class citizens simply because of their culture, who they were. And it also wasn't just that, but it was done generation to generation to generation, 7 generations. And so this trauma had almost like a legacy effect. So then we move into the 60s scoop, if you want to go to the next slide. So in the 50s, the government started transferring their attention from residential schools to rehoming children. And I'll say that lightly because the last residential school closed in 1996. But they focused more on rehoming children. So between 1951 and 1984, approximately 20,000 Indigenous children were rehomed. And what was happening in the beginning here was children would be forcibly removed from their homes and their communities, and the welfare workers were not required to let the communities know where these children were. So a lot of these children were taken out of province. They were taken sometimes out of the country to primarily non-Indigenous homes, to Caucasian homes, in an attempt to assimilate as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the same abuses happened in these homes, and there's a lot of trauma that result from the 60 scoop, and a lot of individuals weren't even told that they were Indigenous. And there's actually there's a whole big movement of people who are still looking for their families because there was the records, like no one was told where they were or where they were taken. And one thing I'll say is in a research study that covered several anti-trafficking organizations that worked with Indigenous women, they interviewed a bunch of survivors, and all of the survivors, every single one who was interviewed, referenced residential schools or child welfare as the root of the human trafficking and abuse that they experienced. If you want to go into the next slide, please. Indian hospitals are something also not a lot of people know about, and I won't cover this for too long. But essentially, they segregated hospitals primarily after World War II, and it wasn't done out of concern for Indigenous peoples. It was actually done out of fear of what Indigenous peoples, the risk that they posed to the non-Indigenous population. And a lot of times these hospitals were underfunded, overcrowded. Some of the individuals working weren't even licensed. There was a lot of abuses that happened in these hospitals. Children were actually experimented on with vaccinations at the time. I would encourage you to look more into it. Our source is referenced there. But if you want to go to the next slide, please. What I want to really stress with this whole history recap is that every single service, from social workers to teachers to law enforcement to nurses to doctors, carry deep-rooted trauma in the minds and bodies of Indigenous peoples. So it's important for those of you watching, if you're involved in services, to understand, like when you have an Indigenous client or you're working with an Indigenous person, to understand that this is the legacy that they come from, where every single service in our country that's meant to care for us and take care of us is actually rooted in a lot of trauma. And it's something that's really important to understand when working with trafficking victims. So this quote is actually from a paper that we reference a lot in this research presentation, essentially just explaining that the trauma continues from generation to generation. So there's a lot that we can cover here, but I want you to take away 4 things from this before we take a quick break. 4 main impacts that resulted in the disproportionate number of Indigenous women in exploitation. The first, if you want to go to the next slide, is the devaluation of women. The second is the breakdown of family. The third is extreme poverty, and all of this leads to the overrepresentation of women in the sex trade. We're going to take a break because I know this is quite heavy and we have some snacks for you guys. But I want to end this section by also acknowledging and honoring the strength of our Indigenous peoples, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Our grandma was a day school survivor, and she loved us unconditionally. She literally helped raise us. She was quick to praise. She was so incredibly patient and loving towards us. The government attempted to literally commit cultural genocide, and we still have and our Indigenous peoples are still here. So I just want to honor their resilience, honor their strength, and just say that there's hope, there's a path forward from this, and we're going to discuss this path forward after our break. So if you guys want to go to the foyer there, we have some snacks and some drinks, and then we'll be back in 10 minutes.